If you've been keeping up with us, we have devoted to 2 programs, this one a week ago and our Yahowah Shabbat program following it, also last Friday, to a review that I wrote on behalf of what will become Chapter 9 in a book called Observations for Our Time. And what happened was, I have this habit, Kirk, of when something strikes me as interesting, I'm like a dog with a bone. I just won't let it go. I just really I want not only to know the answer, I want to go beyond opinion. I want to go beyond conjecture. I want to go way beyond beliefs. I want to be able to track down an answer to the point where you can say, I know for certain this is true because it is derived from irrefutable evidence. Mm-hmm. Now, not a lot of people. Yeah, well, not a lot of people that way. You were certainly that way, and it is an interesting approach to learning, and it was derived from a passage in Bereshit. Now, our listeners know what Bereshit is. Those who may be new to the program or who do not know Yahowah and His Torah, perhaps do not know they have been fooled by the Greek name Genesis. Mm-hmm. Now, I would ask you, Kirk, just as it relates to that name, was the Torah written in Greek?
Never.
Was there a single word of the Torah that was scribed in Greek?
Never spoken in it or scribed in it.
Did Yahowah subsequently say, Revelation, say, boy, this Hebrew language is so unpopular. If really I want to come across as enlightened and I want to reach the world, what I need to do is to give up on Hebrew and I'll write all the prophets and Psalms in Greek.
Nothing is close to Hebrew as being not only a beautiful language, but everything about it is superior to any language ever invented by man.
And so there's no evidence that God ever revealed anything ever in Greek.
Well, you have to think, who is he revealing it through? There were Greeks.
Hebrews. I guess that would be logical. So why do we call the first book of the Torah Genesis by a Greek name?
Because we hate, not us, but because the Western world who preaches Christianity hates everything Yehudim.
But isn't that just a stunning insight as to how corrupt that book that Christians lug around called the Bible actually is? Even the cover of the book, Bible.
Right on it.
The best thing you could say is it's based on a Greek word.
Right.
There's nothing that God spoke. Did Yosha ever speak Greek? Is there a single indication that Yosha, the Christian Jesus, did he ever? Well, I can't say the Christian Jesus, the actual name of the individual that Christians have corrupted into Jesus. Yeah. Did he ever speak Greek?
No, sir.
So why would you pick a Greek word to title the book? Bible? It's a transliteration of Biblos. And of course, it isn't even a Greek word. It's a Egyptian word. It's from Biblia, was the sun goddess in the Egyptian religion. She happened to have a town named after her where papyrus was prolific along the Nile. And so when that papyrus was taken to Phoenicia and grew there, which would be a more convenient place for it because it was a seaport, and therefore they could export, easier to export. And papyrus ultimately became desirable because it was woven, it was woven into pages that were more useful as it relates to writing down books than parchment used to be, than animal skins. Right. And so they moved, so they grew this in Phoenicia, and they named that town after the Egyptian town, therefore after the Egyptian goddess, Biblia. In fact, the town has all sorts of shrines, to our Lord of Biblia. All sorts of them. They're all over the place in this Phoenician town. And so that's how the word was transliterated into Greek, and so it's the name of a pagan goddess. And that's what they put on the cover of their goddamn book.
Now, ask yourself a question. If they're so adamant about putting the 10 statements in stone everywhere.
Right.
What's the first statement say? It says you can't be in both camps at the same time. Don't bring this, one God, be with one God and be with me at the same time.
That is correct. Yeah, the first statement actually identifies God by name.
Yeah.
My name is Yahowah. I was the one who led you out of captivity, away from slavery and the crucifles of human oppression known as Mitzrayim. You will not exist with any other God in my presence.
Right.
You know what's interesting, too, is the second book of this, because we're talking about the lack of credibility of the Christian Bible. The second book is Exodus, a Hebrew word. When you were studying Hebrew and you're looking at the text, did you ever come across the Hebrew word Exodus?
No.
No, as a matter of fact, is there an X in Hebrew?
No.
Do Hebrew words end in us?
No, I don't think so.
No, they don't. And so Exodus is another Greek word.
Mm-hmm.
How about you move on, and next one you have is Leviticus. Now, Leviticus is just a bastardized child. Is there a B in Hebrew?
No.
So the book was named after the Lowy.
Right.
And some idiot transliterated Lowy, the W, which is the O sound, it's a vowel, as a V, even though there's no V in Hebrew.
Right.
Well, that didn't make any sense. And, oh, by the way, is the central theme of the third book of the Torah these fellows known as the Lowy?
Miss Cora called out.
Yeah, well, it's the name of the book because the central theme of the book is about the invitations God is offering us, to call out and be called out and meet with them. So we blew that one too, didn't we?
Yeah, not even close.
No. And numbers. Is there a Hebrew word that you could transliterate numbers?
No. We're all for four.
Just God threw out a lot of numbers in the book. No, and the next book, the fourth of five in the Torah, is Dabarim. I mean, Bamidbar, in the wilderness, Bamidbar. Actually, it's in the place without the word. Yeah, Bamidbar. And then the last book of the Torah, if you were to open your goddamn Bible, you would. And I'm using that term appropriately. I'm not swearing.
Right.
Yeah, it's separated. Yeah, separated from God. Because it is separated from God. There is no godly inspiration.
He's not embracing
in that goddamn book. No. So the next book, according to the Hebrew title, would be Dabarim.
Right.
Words. And yet the Greek title for it is Deuteronomy. You know what Deuteronomy stands for in Greek?
Duo is always two in most of the Latin languages.
Yeah. So. And the Ronomy is based on the Greek word nomos.
Oh, well, that's...
How about second law? That's what it means.
Now,
how would you go and find the truth if you've got a book that has one law, much less two?
Yeah. Good question.
I mean, that's just how utterly stupid it is to trust such a book. And, of course, half of the Christian New Testament was scribed by a man that in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, God called the plague of death, not through one prophet, but through most of his prophets.
Yes, it is all over the place.
So how could you have God's word be presented by someone that God claimed was the plague of death? Or you'd have to be a nutcase. We'd have to be a nutcase even to believe that God inspired Paul, since Paul contradicts God in every possible way. I mean, the God that Paul is speaking for would have to be a schizophrenic, inconsistent, absolutely impotent nincompoop.
Confusing, kind of like the word Babylon.
Yeah, like everything that he said and did doesn't have any merit, that he was completely incapable with his plan to save anyone, so he had to turn to a sexual pervert and vicious despot who was demon-possessed to make it all right. And that's basically what you're accepting if you believe Paul.
That's the premise of the book.
That is the premise of the book. So the thing that caused me to say, you know, I want to find out how we got ourselves in this position was a really simple statement. It's found in Bereshit 6:4. It reads like this: For there, believe it or not, I can read. I can write, I can read. It doesn't appear so at the moment. There were, for a limited period of time, the Nephilim, those who prostrate themselves and are stillborn, falling in prayer, battle, and status, who were militaristic and thus met with an untimely death, existing in the region in those days, but also those bearing a resemblance to them in a slightly different form for some time thereafter. By association, the sons of the Almighty came to, making a habit of pursuing the daughters of man. And they conceived children for themselves. These warriors and politicians, these prominent individuals with the ability to fight who prevailed in their quest for military and political power, who were from a relatively long time ago, are individuals with reputations and recognizable names. They're pretty straightforward, but also extraordinarily insightful. So God was talking about a group of people that he referred to by Nephilim. The YM simply makes it plural, so they're the Nephil.
Any of them, right?
So the Nephil.
Right.
And is Nephil a difficult word to understand the meaning?
No, it's from the fall, and all those things that you said are actually found in any cross-section of lexicons you want to look. Because I looked through the whole thing, and it's Nephilim, and the fall is based on the fall, and it mentions every one of those things. Also, I found bully and tyrant.
Yeah.
You know, and just about anything you want to apply that you would apply to political power, dictators, kings, and religious leaders.
Yeah,
there are no giants. I mean, you know that.
But yes, but the term absolutely does not mean large person or giants. I mean, if you were to change, and that's what virtually every early translation, from the Septuagint to the Vulgate, and the Septuagint and the Vulgate was all there was, really, all the way up into the 14th century, late 14th century, when Wycliffe made an attempt to translate the Vulgate out of Latin into Anglo-Saxon, but even then he did the Christian New Testament. And so, you know, you get into the 15th century, 1,500 years after Yahowah, and the time that this is describing is 4000 BCE, so 5,500 years later before you have an English translation. But, you know, sometimes it's hard. Hard by, I mean, it takes a lot of time. You really got to work at it to look at the roots and meaning of a word. But Nephil? There's only one word, Nephil. And not only is there one word, you hit the gold mine, because the one word is a verb. And in Hebrew, verbs, the actionable word defines the noun, just across the board. So what you have is people who prostrate themselves in prayer and who are stillborn, falling in prayer, falling in battle, falling in status, who are militaristic and met with an untimely death.
Hill lost west away.
And so what I wanted to find is how in the world, although it seemed pretty obvious to me, instinctively I've done this enough that as I was translating this and considering all of the English Bible translations to the contrary, instantly I knew that some idiot, many thousand, well now about probably 2,200 years ago, was trying to create a Greek translation of the Hebrew Torah, prophets, and Psalms, and he came across Nephilim, and he didn't have a clue what it was. So he said, take a stab. let's see, it's talking about, the sons of God and, the daughters of men, and oh my goodness. Why don't we, I got it. I'm going to write down giants. Who's going to know? Right? That's what happened.
But you go down a couple of words later and you get Gabor, which describes these mighty men. And once again,
then you're thinking. Then you're thinking.
Well, wait a minute. It's telling you right what that word means down here.
Yeah. Yeah. He tells you what the word means in the conclusion of the sentence, and the next sentence, Bereshit 6:5, is a vivid depiction of exactly who the Nephilim are. But if you're doing that, you're having to go to the trouble of reading, viewing something in context. That wasn't the purpose of a scribe. It's like these idiots that can recite the Quran. No. Because that's not. They weren't paid to be smart. They weren't paid to be thoughtful. They weren't even paid to be accurate. They were only paid to do what they were asked to do, which was to create a copy in the language that somebody wanted it in.
Okay, so it's like the modern American.
It's like the guys that memorize the Quran and haven't got a clue what it says. Yeah. There you go. So as you look at this, you have to wonder, well, how it happened. And immediately I came to the conclusion that it was in the Septuagint. The Vulgate replaced the Septuagint when it was copied from the old Latin copies were merged together with a guy that did read Greek, but we're just basically parroting the Septuagint, because the guys that wrote the old Latin copies and Jerome for the Vulgate, they weren't Hebrew scholars. They didn't even have Hebrew manuscripts available to them. So, first guy makes the mistake. They're copyists. They just copied the mistake. And that's what ultimately happened with every English Bible translation, because the Septuagint wrote giants, the Vulgate has giants. They're both wrong. And then when Wycliffe translated it into Anglo-Saxon, he was translating the Vulgate. He translated giants. And when you had the 5 English translations that followed it, leading up to the King James, they all were revisions. They were copyists, if you will. We call it plagiarizing today. But they just simply revised the prior English translation, having no access to the Hebrew, but occasionally looking at the Greek. But they didn't even have decent copies of the Septuagint. Much so they were simply revising translations out of the Latin, and therefore every one of them was wrong. Every one of them had giants. And I think it's very similar to, how did we get into the mess of having Eve? Eve is a Greek name.
Yeah, and worse is a sun goddess.
Yeah, Eve is a Greek name. And so if you were to read virtually every English translation, you're going to see Eve. You read the Septuagint, you see Eve. You read the Vulgate, you see Eve. And so we get into a position where Christians think, well, my Bible is correct because they all read similarly. Well, they're all similarly wrong.
Yeah, therefore, if everybody agrees, it must be the truth.
Right. The name that is called Eve in the Christian Bible is Yahowah. Eve is a Greek name. Yahowah is a Hebrew name. Yahowah is a Hebrew name. It's a really important Hebrew name. Yeah. It's based on Chaya. It means, life. So and what's interesting, of course, is that Adam, when he chooses the name for his wife, explains the name. Because she's the source of life.
Right.
And he explains the name and says, I'm going to give her the name Yahowah because it's based on Chaya, which is source of life. And it's actually the same word that English Bibles are consistently write as bow down and worship. Chaya, meaning, because it's not just that's Chaya. It would be the Hebrew word for life, but it's also the Hebrew word for to make a declaration, to make a statement, to affirm a declaration on life would be the meaning of her name. Because Yahowah is actually a blend of Hebrew words. So you look at this stuff and say, how in the world do you explain every English Bible being wrong with Nephilim, changing it to giants, or wrong with Eve, as opposed to Yahowah?
Well,
unless they're just copying one another. The first one made a mistake, and since then, none of them bothered to correct it.
Well, you wrote years ago that a lot of this is because the stuff the familiar sells. You can't afford to change it because you do, and then nobody will buy your book, and they're absolutely out of money, so they don't.
Does Tiger Woods or Rory McIlroy having a swoosh on their shirt and on their cap, does it tell you anything about the Nike brand in terms of how the shoes are made, how the clubs are crafted? Does it do anything other than just make you familiar with the Nike logo?
Well, I'm sure the sweatshop owner just says, just do it.
There you go, Scott.
I still remember that.
When Coca-Cola does a commercial and they have people whistling and singing and occasionally holding up a Coke, are they telling you that Coke really tastes good, or are they just trying to keep that logo in your presence?
It's symbol for me.
They want it familiar.
Right.
Yeah, familiarity is what sells. And and as it relates to Bible translations, if somebody, for example, when the Queen Elizabeth chafed against the Geneva Bible because the Geneva Bible had footnotes that said this whole idea that kings have a divine right to rule is rubbish. Well, that's really tough if you want to be a king or a queen. So she had what's called the Bishop's Bible penned, and it got rid of those dastardly marginal notes. But the Bishop's Bible is almost word for word the Geneva Bible. It just doesn't have the marginal notes.
Yeah.
And then when King James, came into power and realized, gosh darn, that Bishop's Bible didn't get any traction. No one's reading it. I mean, we didn't even sell 1,000 copies of it. Now what are we going to do? The Geneva Bible is still whooping us, and it says that kings don't have any right to rule. And hey, man, I got a problem here. And so he created the King James. You know, there's a 95% overlap between the King James, the Bishop Bible, and the Geneva Bible. 95% overlap.
95% overlap?
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah. So why would they have a 95% overlap? Because familiarity sells.
Yeah.
You know, if the New American Standard Bible, and the NIV were to come up with a accurate translation of the Hebrew, it would be so different than what people are accustomed to. There wouldn't be a pastor in the world who was schooled on, the previous translation that would say, I would recommend this for my congregation, because it's inconsistent with what they have embraced. And so that's the problem. Yeah, that's why they all copy each other.
Go back to Nephilim just for a second. It took me 20 minutes because I'm slow. It would take most of the average person probably 12, 15 minutes to do it. I looked up Nephilim and got the same results that you did. It says go to Nephal. I got the same results you did, even more so. That takes you to Nephel. I mean, and these are all Christian publication lexicons. And it says in the Nephel, it talks about the miscarriage. That's why it's stillborn. Then you go to Mephel, which becomes worthless, to bow down, people like that. And then we go to Min-Nephel, which is ruin, pile of rubbish, human waste.
Right.
Then you go down to another variation of that slightly, which says ruin crashing down in a human carcass. Now, interestingly enough, so that covers everything you had, plus I found some more. You go down to one, this just kind of was funny.
By the way, if you put all things together, it means they were acting religious, by bowing down, and that by bowing down and acting religious, they were prone to fighting. They were prone to fighting wars, which caused them to fall in wars, caused them to fall in status because God won't have anything to do with religious people, and because they promoted this as their patriotic duty, their children were stillborn.
Right. You just killed the whole family.
Right.
Interestingly, though, this was funny. Right below the word, because I've been going, as you suggested, keep going.
Right, keep going. Right.
And the mafal, right, the same part of the mafal, there's a short version which is a PH lam and a G, PLG, and that means the land is divided by rivers.
That's not good.
Instantly, I think you.
Yeah, that's not good. Yeah.
Modern nafals.
Wow, that's not good.
That doesn't prove anything, but I thought it was just hilarious.
Yeah, one of about 20 adjectives that Yahowah uses to describe America and Yeshaya, Isaiah 18, and I mean there is no question he's talking about America, but one of them is the land divided by rivers, and so when you read that word, that would give you great consternation, because we are the living embodiment of that word today. That's why it says in the text, and people like them for some time thereafter. And the next line is, there would be people like them, similar to them, for some time thereafter.
Right.
Yeah. Read the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Roman Catholic Church, and today's incarnation of those things, the Americans.
Yeah. Americans have a way of stopping right about the Ottoman Empire or the British Empire. They stop before the British Empire, and then they just think everything is hunky-dory after that.
Yeah. So here we talked a little bit about Jerome, and this is what he wrote to his Pope. We talked about this in our last program. He says, writing to the Pope, if we are to pen our faith on the Latin text, not the Hebrew text, on the Latin text. Why was it the Latin text? Because it was the Roman Catholic Church. It is for our opponents to tell us which. What he's saying by that is there are so many variations, anybody who was arguing with them would pick the variation that was favorable to them. For there are almost as many forms of text as there are copies. What he's identifying here in the Latin is the same thing that already existed in the Greek. Hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts, none of which agree. They're all wildly different. Therefore, this notion, well, I can't believe that God wouldn't protect His holy word. Bull. Bull.
But you have to go to the Hebrew.
Well, that's true. The Hebrew has been pretty well preserved. But the Greek, no. The Latin, no. It's an absolute mess. And English translations.
That's the hard news for everybody.
Yeah.
He didn't even care about that stuff.
No, he didn't care about it, because he never reveals himself in Greek or Latin. As a matter of fact, he called both Greece and Rome beasts. He goes on to say, if, on the other hand, we are to glean, that means glean is an interesting form of harvest. It is a secondary harvest where very little is plucked that is useful. But if we are to glean the truth from a comparison of many, now think about that. What he's saying is, if we are to surmise some nuggets of truth here, the only way we can do so is by looking at these wildly divergent texts and choosing the parts that we like.
So usable truth.
Oh, I mean, it's just stunning. I mean, it's just like if you had 20 guys lined up and they read 20 different telephone numbers, and you say, we can find glean some nugget of the right number by listening to these 20 people utter different numbers. That's what he's saying here. You'd have to be, at that point, Christianity should have been stillborn. But he's not finished. He had more to say, and we'll finish what he had to say after this break. All right, Kirk, you were holding me accountable for something. I keep on referring to a fellow named Jerome, because if you look up who is the author of the Latin Vulgate, it always says Jerome. But his name wasn't Jerome, was it?
No.
And the reason we know his name wasn't Jerome is when was the letter J first invented and first used?
17th century CE.
Oh, my goodness. So we're off by a very long time. In fact, what the gentleman's name was actually, being nice by calling him a gentleman, he's a scumbag, saint scumbag to Roman Catholics. It was Eusebius Sophronius. Eusebius Sophronius. Now, I don't know how you get Jerome out of Eusebius Sophronius.
How do you get Paul out of Shaul?
Well, Paul changed his name. Paul deliberately changed his name from, but you know, he admits that his name was Shaul because when Satan was talking to him on the road to Damascus, he's Shaul, Shaul. So he admits that his name was Shaul, but Paul didn't want anything to do with Hebrew, because if you knew Hebrew, you knew that Paul was a liar. So Paul chose to side with Rome and took a Latin name, meaning lowly and little. Now, returning to Eusebius Sophronius, he says, if, on the other hand, we were to glean the truth by a comparison of many, and now he's talking about comparing texts which have almost nothing in common, why not go back to the original Greek?
Well, of course.
But there's a problem with that. Well, why don't we call him, instead of Eusebius, Arrhenius?
Arrhenius, yeah, that's very good. Really.
Okay, Arrhenius. Was the Torah written in Greek?
No, sir.
Were the prophets written in Greek?
No, sir.
Were the Psalms written in Greek?
Not a one.
Did Yosha speak Greek?
No record of it.
No. So, it wasn't the original Greek, was it?
No.
So his plan to correct the flaws in Latin were to go to the original Greek, and yet the Greek wasn't the original.
Well, we have a problem here.
Hey, Houston, we have a problem. And he says, go back to the original Greek and correct the mistakes introduced by inaccurate translators. Well, okay.
Which one?
Which one? Which one are the inaccurate translators? The Greek is a translation, just as the Latin is a translation. So if you're admitting that the translators are inaccurate, well, you have a real problem. Now you've got two inaccurate translations. An inaccurate translation of Hebrew to Greek and an inaccurate translation of Greek to Latin. So that's how they're going to correct the mistakes of the inaccurate translators and the blundering alterations. Now, this blundering alterations, that means it could be by accident, or alterations typically is purposeful, of confident but ignorant critics. And further, all that has been inserted or changed by copyists more asleep than awake. So we have blundering alterations, we have changes which have been inserted by comatose copiers, we have inaccurate translators, and you know something? We're not even out of the 5th century.
No.
This is, in fact, we're in the 4th century. This was written just shy of 400 CE. And already what you have is a swamp. You know, I use the term swamp to describe this, so we're going to get to that in just a moment. And I thought maybe I was a little harsh. And then I was going on and furthering this chapter, and I was translating the conditions that existed at the time of the flood that necessitated the flood in the region of Mesopotamia by Yahowah. And one of the more interesting words, it is Hamas.
Really?
And Hamas speaks of a swamp, a murky. He says the problem was that man turned the earth into a mucky and murky swamp. So maybe I wasn't so far off.
Yeah, I think you nailed it.
Yeah. So here we go. So by the 4th century, these are the 300 CEs. Greek copies of the Christian New Testament were so divergent from one another. Not only had they already become unreliable, the only way to fix the problem was to distill the vast array of errors into a single amalgamation of those many mistakes. This all obliterates the myth held by Christians that God would never allow his word to be corrupted. Sorry, but facts are facts. As a result, he either allowed it to be corrupted, or your God was impotent and could do nothing to stop it. As for the books that would have had merit, Matanya, Yahowah, and Revelation. Now, by the way, was there one of the disciples, did he have a name Matthew?
No, sir.
Did one of the disciples have the name John?
No.
No.
Hardly with a J.
No. So there you go, another problem. But we can correct that. It was Matanya and Yahowah.
Yes, we can. And I can say it. I can write it.
All right. Now, unfortunately, those books which would have held merit have all been destroyed by translators and copyists. And a glaring example of this would be the story of the adulterous woman. You know, and it's, you'll find it in John 8:1-11. You know, the entire episode, the adulterous woman is brought to him, and he writes something in the sand. Nobody knows where it is, but the secret code is there in the sand. And then he says, "Let him without sin cast the first stone." What a resounding line! Probably the most preached subject in Christian churches. John 8:1-11, the whole story. Well, can you find that story? Can you find that story in the earliest copies of John from the early 2nd, 3rd, 4th century?
I don't think you can find it before about the 6th century.
Oh no, that's too way too
the only reason
early.
I say that is because I have a what's his name, that found one of the Septuagint, the one down in Catherine's.
Oh no, that doesn't. It's not in that. No, it's not in that. You're talking about the one that's in St. Catherine's Monastery. That is the Codex Sinaiticus. Yeah, no, it's not in that.
No, I thought it. Okay.
No, it's not in the Codex Sinaiticus.
It's academic to me when if it's not in there in the first 400 or 500 years. It's got nothing.
Its first appearance. The first appearance is circa the 8th century.
Okay.
And by the time you had thousands of manuscripts, that doesn't exist. It was added because the Christians wanted their God-man to contradict the Torah.
Yeah.
That's why it was added. But if you have something that significant added, what are you going to trust? You'd be a fool to trust it. You know, the entire episode is bogus. 8th century. There is no record of it in any of the many hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts composed between the 1st and 8th century. Not one. The entire episode was made up. Simply stated, this text of the Christian New Testament cannot be trusted. It has been in a constant state of degradation since it was first composed. The problem
why doesn't that register with people who write to you and tell you that your translations are off, and their King James, which is Shakespeare in English, another translation, 4 times removed or 100 times removed? Why doesn't that register with people? They just don't want it. They just don't care.
People of faith are allergic to evidence and reason.
Yeah.
Now, if you were to seek proof of this, read Philip Comfort's text of the earliest New Testament Greek manuscripts, where all 69 pre-Constantine manuscripts are presented for your consideration. Don't blame me for lack of faith until you've observed the evidence. In the introduction to his book, Comfort wrote, "This book provides transcriptions of 69 of the earliest New Testament manuscripts. All of the manuscripts are dated from the early 2nd century to the beginning of the 4th, AD 100 to 300. We chose the AD 300 as our terminus dacum because New Testament manuscript production changed radically after the persecution under Diocletian in AD 303 to 305, and especially after Constantine declared Christianity to be a legal religion in the empire. Changed radically, my friend. When applied to manuscript production, means that the manuscripts copied after 325 CE were so different than their predecessors, they were no longer comparable. Those are facts. You know, people think they're entitled to their opinions, but nobody is entitled to their own set of facts. Now, if you and I were to dive into a swamp and grab a bucket full of alligator excrement and dissect them, study them by amplifying them individually and collectively under a microscope, sharing every nuance that can be derived from a close and careful examination of said specimens, the fact remains that all we have is a bucket full of reptilian discharge that has been rotting away in a swamp. Nothing will ever change that. No matter how accurate or complete our rendition of the information conveyed therein becomes, it makes no difference how one slices them, analyzes them, polishes them, or rearranges them. Swamps not only tend to breed bacteria, they are home to some of the world's most venomous and deadly reptiles, and are not safe for human habitation. Such is the case with the manuscripts of the Greek text of the Christian New Testament. Any attempt to accurately translate what remains is akin to evaluating decomposing organic material plucked from a swamp.
Clean that one up.
As crude as this may sound, even shocking, it accurately depicts the conditions of the Christian New Testaments. And oh, by the way,
mental picture there.
According to God, it's the reason for the flood. It is a central definition of Hamas, the term that Yahowah used to say that corruption and perversion had reached such an extent that man had essentially turned the region into a swamp, to a quagmire, to a grave where bodies would rot. Now, as it relates to the actual Word of God, the Torah prophets and Mizmor, the Torah Nambi and Mizmor, to use the Hebrew words, the evidence is nearly as damning from one perspective, at least from the perspective of the Christian Bible and their translations. Between those who edited and created the Septuagint by translating the text from Hebrew to Greek, and those who copied their work, they were no more competent or inerrant. And as proof of this, by the dawn of the 3rd century CE, discrepancies between the many copies of the Greek Septuagint had become so pervasive, they required better part of a lifetime to resolve. A resolution, however, that has been lost to time. 3rd century Christian scholar Origen devoted most of his life to overcoming these disparities. And he did the exact same thing that Jerome, erroneous now in our parlance, tried to do with the divergent Latin text that copyists and critics and others had made a mess of, turned into a swamp of excrement. But he tried to do it for the predecessor to the Latin text, which is the Greek Septuagint. And he created what was called the hextabula of Greek translations. And he did it in Alexandria, which was the birthplace of the Septuagint. Now, in his commentary on what he called the Gospel of Matthew, he explained the purpose for creating this. This was his lifetime work. He says, due to the discrepancies. Now, this is going to sound a lot like our pal erroneous, Jerome. Due to the discrepancies between the manuscripts of the Old Testament, we are able to overcome them using the testimony of other editions. Now, he's not talking about Hebrew. He's talking about Greek. This is because these points in the Septuagint, affirming that he's talking about Greek, which because of discrepancies, manuscripts aroused doubt. That's a powerful statement. So we reevaluated them on the basis of other editions. This is exactly what happened with the Quran. Now, the Quran, of course, is an 8th century document. But on the Quran, Muhammad admits that the Quran was harder to retain consistently than a runaway camel. And he would even talk about the variations of the Quran and whose variation that he preferred. And so in written Arabic didn't even exist at the time that the Quran was allegedly revealed, and when they finally had written Arabic, it wasn't actually written Arabic, it was Hebrew. And so they tried to write it down, and of course they just came out with many different versions. So the Hadith, the oral reports from Muhammad and his companion, say that Abu Bakr, he's the fellow, upstanding citizen, he's the fellow that to endear himself with Muhammad, gave Muhammad his 6-year-old daughter as a sex toy. Yeah, when Muhammad was 50 years old. That's how upstanding he was. So this upstanding moral bastion of human dignity and character decided that because there were so many variations, there would be no way to have an authoritarian rule. And there's no way to say, this is the word of God perfectly delivered from Allah through Muhammad, unless all variations were eliminated. And that's what he did. He just simply disposed of all the variations. That's what Jerome did. There were so many variations of the Latin that, as he said, we can't pin our faith on the Latin text because there are too many variations. He just eliminated all the competition. He only had one left, and if he has one left and all the rest are destroyed, what do you got? Now that one's the authorized word of God, and inerrant, yeah, exactly. And so that is exactly what now is happening with Origen and the Septuagint. We said there's so many variant copies, there's so many differences that the discrepancies are causing people to lose their faith. And the only way to resolve that is to end up with one, to homogenize them together and come up with one variation, one version out of the many flawed versions. So his assessment of the Septuagint was therefore identical to Arrhenius's evaluation of the Latin text. Discrepancies abound. His solution was also the same. Compare texts filled with disagreements and choose which variations to accept and discard. Now, I can get into his some detail here, but just a summary form. The reason it was called a hexapla, what he did is he pulled together 4 blended translations that he was able to find in various parts of Egypt. And then he had a copy of the Torah, Prophets, and Psalms transliterated into Greek, and then another copy actually written in the Hebrew text. But there's no indication that he was a Hebrew scholar or even a Hebrew student of Hebrew. But anyway, he had all of those there, and he then attempted to justify a resolved text. But the problem is that his little project, well, it turned into a project that was so large, it's 6,000 pages long. Now, 6,000 pages long back in the day when you didn't have a printing press, handwritten, and only one copy, 15 volumes, 6,000 pages long. However, let's just say that he created some manner of resolution to fix this problem through those 6,000 pages. Lost to time. He was poorly regarded, seldom considered. He was defrocked. He was banished from Alexandria by Bishop Demetrius. He fled to Israel, where he was tortured by Emperor Decius. Pardon?
Why do you think he went there?
Well, you know, you're in Alexandria.
Yeah.
You have the bishop of Egypt that is trying to kill you. You know, what's the closest place you can go that's outside of his control?
Yeah, and you would have thought he would just kept going though, rather than.
Yeah. But the closer he got to, for example, Constantinople, the worse it would have been for him. Yeah. In fact, it was a Roman emperor that killed him.
Yeah.
So upon his death, the lone copy of his hexapla was hidden away in the library of the bishops of Caesarea, collecting dust for centuries. It was then destroyed during the Muslim invasion in 638 CE. So all we know is that, and you know, it's not that he didn't provide a service. While his book did us no good whatsoever.
Service to whom? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the fact that he did declare that after a lifetime of work in 6,000 pages, that the Septuagint by that time was untrustworthy. It was way too corrupt. That again should send shivers down the spine of anyone who was a Christian.
Now, is there a theologian anywhere that would not have read this, had to read this in their school?
I don't know. I don't know if they, who's going to stay, who's going to continue to be who's going to continue in Bible school?
If they read
if they were.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Point taken.
Now, there was a lone potential beneficiary. Was the book that the manuscript that you mentioned, the Codex Sinaiticus, was, but it was deliberately hidden in St. Catherine's Monastery, and that was Constantine's mama, in the Sinai Peninsula.
Right.
It was not discovered until the 19th century, when its contents were quickly dismembered and scattered around the world. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the Codex was made available to textual critics, which is to say, apart from proving that the Septuagint was unreliable, the Hextapula project was a complete waste of time. So now that we know that the Latin Vulgate was nothing more than a compilation of errors of earlier translators and copyists that they had made based upon the Septuagint, and that the early Greek manuscripts were similarly flawed, let's complete the story. How did the errors and divergent renderings found in the Greek Septuagint and Latin Vulgate find their way into the earliest English translations? With so many variants, why are English translations, the earliest ones, all exactly the same?
Well, they have to copy the Jerome's.
You betcha. The first to compose and distribute an English translation was a fellow named John Wycliffe, producing them by hand around 1380 CE. To his credit, he did so because by reading the Latin Vulgate, he recognized that the teachings and claims of the Roman Catholic Church were wholly inconsistent with the text of the book they claimed had authorized them to be the exclusive representatives of God on earth. Now, Roman Catholics today have no excuse. It takes 15 minutes to recognize that the claims of the Roman Catholic Church are in direct conflict with the Word of God. But, it took a man of courage back then to say this and to deal with it, to expose it. His resulting translation, however, wasn't based on a Hebrew or Greek text, but instead was derived from an amalgamation of errors known as the Latin Vulgate, only because there were no Hebrew or Greek texts available to him. Wycliffe and his associates produced 12 copies. Most were burned by the Roman Catholic Church on orders of the Pope. He was so infuriated with Wycliffe for translating the Latin Vulgate into a language ordinary people could actually read for themselves. Wycliffe was banished as a heretic, and 44 years after his death, the Pope had his bones dug up, crushed, burned, and then scattered.
Yeah.
Even worse, John Huss, one of Wycliffe's associates, for the crime of opposing the tyranny of the Roman Catholic Church, was burned alive by the Church in 1415. Not only was that the prescribed penalty of the Roman Catholic Church for anyone possessing a non-Latin Bible, the Pope used Wycliffe's translations to kindle the fire, to burn a man alive who simply wanted people to know the truth. If you were among the 1.2 billion who call themselves a Roman Catholic, you should be ashamed of yourself. Today the Pope, he was over there and I think Auschwitz, one of the concentration camps. I think it was Auschwitz. And you know what his claim his big statement was when he was in Auschwitz? He asked God to forgive the horror that took place there.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that God is going to forgive those who massacred 12 million people, 6 million Jews, but 12 million people total in those concentration camps? Not only murdered 12 million Jews, 2 million of them were children under the age of 2.
Yeah.
Do you think that God is going to forgive them so that we'll get to see them in heaven?
Terry and I had this same conversation earlier today. It's absolutely not.
No. Wait.
How disgusting.
It is for him, first of all, for him to think that God listens to him, that he can influence God, is preposterous. But to think that God would forgive people like this so that their sins would be wiped away and that they would come through the door of heaven, that we would spend our eternity with those scumbags? I mean, think of the level of depravity. That you'd kill 2 million children under the age of 2 and 12 million people in concentration camps, bringing them there for the purpose of mass execution, and that you would ask God to forgive them? Oh.
It's unbelievable.
In 1490, Oxford professor and physician Thomas Linacre, after reading the biographical accounts in the Greek New Testament, and then comparing them to what he had read in the Latin Vulgate, concluded that they were so different that they could not have come from the same source. He was right. Then in 1516, the precursor to the intellectual fraud and financial hoax known as the Texas Receptus was perpetrated on an unwary public by Desiderius Aramus, Roterdamus. He was a living contradiction. He was a celebrated Dutch humanist, a homosexual who was known to have affairs with his colleagues and students, a Catholic priest, way ahead of his time, devoted to the Pope, a critic of the Catholic Church, and a Latin scholar, as well as a Protestant protagonist.
That's a lot on your plate, isn't it?
That's a lot on your plate. The moment he mastered Latin to his satisfaction, he attempted to replicate Jerome's work. And in 1512, he collected every Latin manuscript he could find to create his own edition by consolidating the divergent texts. Of this he wrote, "It is only fair that Paul should address the Romans in somewhat better Latin." That was his motivation. It's only fair that Paul should address the Romans in somewhat better Latin. Oh, man, he could not contain his enthusiasm or ego, writing, "My mind is so excited at the thought of amending Jerome's text with notes that I seem to myself inspired by some god."
Guess which one?
I seem to myself inspired by some god. Indeed. No one paid much. Now, by the way, with Jerome, you just can't wipe him off and say, "Oh, well, so that was just Jerome." That was the basis of your English Bibles. That was the only Christian Bible for over 1,000 years. And now if you want to poke holes in Erasmus, good luck with that, because guess what Erasmus provided? The Textus Receptus. It's the only text that can claim to have played any role other than the Latin Vulgate in your Christian translations. And we're going to learn a lot about this man, both on this program and again tonight on Yahowah Radio. Now, no one paid much attention to Erasmus's Vulgate changes, his own version, so he sought fame by beating the Roman Catholics to their Compulsanium Polygot to print. That was, the Roman Catholics decided after 1,000 years that they were going to produce a Christian New Testament in Greek. And old Erasmus said, "Boy, if we can beat them to print, we'll have a bestseller on our hands." More this evening.